Did you ever believe that the person who swore to love you, the one you built a life and a home with, could turn that sacred vow into a legal noose? Did you ever stand in the wreckage of your own life and realize that your scorned ex-spouse wasn't just cruel, but was actually using the entire justice system, the system built to protect the vulnerable, as his own personal, perfectly polished weapon? If you have, then you know the chill that runs deeper than any winter wind. It's the chill of absolute systemic betrayal. It's the realization that some people don't just move on, they seek to erase you entirely, to ensure your very existence is a financial liability they no longer have to bear. Welcome to the Reckoning Files, the chronicle where we pull back the curtain on the deepest, darkest betrayals and the most exquisitely planned acts of justice. These aren't just stories. They are survival guides, written in blood and boardroom contracts. Before we dive into the deep end of Sarah's devastating account, do me a favor. If you believe, as I do, that the wicked should never prosper in the quiet aftermath of their cruelty, then hit that subscribe button and join our community. Your support ensures these truths, these vital warnings, never fade into silence. Now, let us begin. This is the first entry in. The ex-husband who refused alimony and paid the price. Chapter 1. The Cold Verdict. I never thought I'd be writing my memoir, let alone a chapter that reads like a deposition for a financial crime. But here we are. My name is Sarah, and until not long ago, I was just a woman trying to keep the lights on after a messy divorce from a man whose heart was colder than his high-end downtown office building. My ex-husband, Mark. Just the name tastes like old metal and regret. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was a master of the system, a man whose entire career was built on finding the razor-thin legal distinctions that meant the difference between ruin and absolute domination. He didn't just file for divorce, he orchestrated a strategic corporate restructuring of my life. I was 42, standing in the kitchen of the home I was about to lose, clutching a heavy cream-colored envelope. It wasn't the kind of stationery you used for thank you notes. This was the paper they printed the legal guillotine on. Mark's final filing. The final, brutal blow aimed at severing the last fragile thread of my financial stability, the spousal support stipulation. A material change in circumstances. The petitioner, Mark, finds that the respondent, Sarah, has failed to make diligent efforts toward reemployment commensurate with her capabilities, thus rendering the existing alimony agreement punitive and financially unwarranted. I didn't need a lawyer to translate that legal jargon. It meant, you're an extra mouth I no longer want to feed, and I'm legally cutting you off. That document wasn't just a piece of paper. It was Mark looking me in the eye and declaring me worthless. I could almost hear his voice, smooth, educated, and utterly venomous, coming from the tightly printed paragraphs. He knew exactly what that support meant. It was the tuition for my daughter, the mortgage on the small condo I'd bought, the thin sliver of dignity that kept me from having to beg. I walked to the kitchen counter, my movements feeling sluggish, like navigating water through a thick film of oil. I placed the letter next to the stack of unpaid bills and stared at it. This is where the moral dichotomy of our story truly began. Mark, the wealthy legal eagle sitting in his mahogany office, calculating the precise moment to pull the plug to maximize his liquidity, all while maintaining the facade of a reasonable, responsible father. And me, Sarah, the woman who spent 2 decades supporting his career, hosting his clients, and raising his children, now faced with the raw, terrifying logistics of survival. My internal monologue at that moment wasn't a scream. It was a cold, quiet realization. He didn't want justice. He wanted submission. He wanted to see me sweat. He wanted the system to validate his inherent cruelty. I remembered the last conversation we had face to face, months ago, right after the first round of legal maneuvers failed to completely crush me. He'd smiled, that slow, arrogant smile that always preceded a verbal ambush. "You know, Sarah," he'd said, adjusting his bespoke suit jacket, "you should really stop fighting. You're wasting your time and what little money you have left. I wrote the book on this system. You can't win." I had stayed silent then, too. That was before this final filing. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the quiet settling of a woman who had just realized she was at the absolute bottom. The imagery was vivid. The legal document was a black hole, and I was being sucked into it, not screaming, but watching the light fade as I was consumed. I didn't call my lawyer. What was the point? Mark had already proven he could outlawyer everyone. He was playing chess, and I was fumbling with checkers. If he wanted to fight in the legal arena, fine, but I couldn't beat him by using his rules. I had to learn them, internalize them, and then use them against him in a way he would never see coming. The strong hook wasn't just the letter. It was the decision that followed. I stood there, taking a slow, deep breath, letting the shame of his words, unwarranted, failed, punitive, wash over me one last time. Then, the true power of silence took hold. I picked up the letter, folded it precisely, and tucked it into a drawer, not out of resignation, but out of cold, clear planning. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I looked at the number of Mark's law firm printed neatly on the stationery and I thought, "You used your expertise to make me destitute. Now, I will use your own system to make you desperate." The game was over. The new one was just beginning. And this time, Mark wouldn't even know he was playing until the checkmate was called. Chapter 2. The Tipping Point. The rage Mark had inspired in Chapter 1 was cold, but it was abstract. It lived in a legal document, bound by stipulations and clauses. The reality of his cruelty, the visceral, gut-wrenching consequence of that material change in circumstances, hit me where it hurt most, through my daughter, Sophia. The alimony hadn't just been money, it had been a protective barrier. When Mark severed it, the floodwaters didn't wait. They rushed in immediately. Suddenly, grocery store trips felt less like shopping and more like triage. Every swipe of the debit card was an act of triage, a choice between electricity or tuition. And then there was Sophia's piano lessons. Sophia, 12 years old, her entire world built on the ivory keys and the promise of a future on the stage. Her lessons, her passion, her anchor, were expensive. They were a luxury Mark could easily afford, yet they were the first casualty of his calculated financial war. I remember the day I had to tell her. I sat her down, wrapping my arms around her slight frame, the smell of her favorite lilac shampoo, a poignant reminder of the things I was struggling to keep normal. "Mommy has to pause your lessons for a while, sweetie," I murmured, "just until I get my feet under me." She didn't scream or argue. That was the terrible beauty of Sophia. She understood instinctively that my pain was greater than her disappointment. Her silence, the quiet devastation in her intelligent blue eyes, was 1,000 times more brutal than any scream could have been. That was the climax of despair. Not my own hardship, but witnessing the collateral damage Mark had inflicted on the innocent. And then Mark showed up. He always knew how to twist the knife in public. The scene was the annual recital at Sophia's music school. I hadn't wanted to go, knowing she wasn't performing, but I had to support the few friends she had left there. I stood awkwardly near the back, wearing a dress I'd worn 10 times too many, when the air around me shifted. Mark walked in, impeccably dressed, his current girlfriend, a woman 10 years his junior, draped in diamonds, attached to his arm. He spotted me immediately. He didn't approach for a polite greeting, he approached for a performance. "Sarah," he stated, his voice carrying just enough to turn a few heads. No warmth, no hint of shared history. Just a flat, professional greeting that implied I was an unwelcome fixture. "Mark," I replied, forcing my face into the mask of professional indifference I'd been perfecting. He leaned in, the faint, expensive scent of his cologne assaulting me. I was surprised not to see Sophia's name on the program. Pity. She has real talent, wasted by a lack of commitment. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. It was a difficult choice, Mark. One I had to make without the financial support you legally terminated. He chuckled, a dry, cynical sound that grated on my nerves. Legal, Sarah. Always legal. Perhaps you should focus less on blame and more on providing a stable environment. It's truly unfortunate that her passion has to suffer because you can't manage your finances. Then came the true, gut-wrenching blow, the public humiliation, designed to shatter my composure. He glanced toward his girlfriend, then back at me, his eyes dead cold. "Tell you what, if you are truly struggling to provide basic enrichment, maybe it's time we revisit the custody agreement. I could ensure Sophia never misses another lesson. Think about it. Give her to me, and she gets her piano back." The words hung in the air. Give her to me. He wasn't offering help. He was offering a trade. My motherhood for my daughter's happiness. He was suggesting, in a public forum, that I was an incompetent, failed mother. I felt the blood drain from my face. My internal monologue screamed for me to grab the nearest glass and smash it, to expose the monster he truly was. I wanted to scream, "You are the reason we're struggling, you legal parasite." But I remembered the silent vow I'd made over that cursed letter. No begging. No screaming. No submission. I looked directly into his eyes. I let the silence stretch, thick and terrible, until he slightly shifted under the pressure of my gaze. It was the first time I hadn't immediately crumbled under his attack. Finally, I spoke, my voice a quiet, dangerous whisper that didn't travel beyond the two of us. "Mark," I said, "I will manage my own affairs, and I will never let you weaponize my child again. You may have won the battle with your lawyers, but you have no idea what war you've just started." I didn't wait for his reply. I turned and walked out, the expensive perfume of his girlfriend and the polished, indifferent faces of the wealthy parents blurring behind me. I drove home that night, the car silent except for the hum of the engine. The tears came later, but they were silent, scalding tears that burned away the last remnants of the woman Mark had known. He had forced me to choose between survival and my child's passion. Now, I knew what I had to do. I had to become a weapon myself. The struggle wasn't just about alimony anymore. It was about justice, control, and reclaiming the dignity he had publicly stripped away. And to do that, I needed power. I needed a secret. I needed an edge. And the first domino had already fallen, waiting for me in the old attic. Chapter 3. The Lost Bequest. The vow I made in the school parking lot, the silent declaration that Mark would never weaponize my child again, was the turning point. But vows are cheap. Execution is everything. And execution, in the legal and financial arena Mark inhabited, required a war chest and a weapon forged in the fires of expertise. My rage was a dull, burning coal in my gut, but I knew better than to let it erupt. Mark thrived on emotion. He could swat away a screaming woman with the same cool indifference he used to dismiss a tedious brief. To beat him, I couldn't be a screaming woman. I had to become a calculated asset, cold and precise. But where does a newly destitute 40-something single mother find a war chest? The answer initially was nowhere. I spent the next 2 weeks navigating the sheer, terrifying logistics of Financial triage. The small equity I had pulled from the condo sale was dwindling faster than ice in the Texas sun. Every hour I spent applying for minimum wage jobs was an hour I wasn't spending devising a strategy to defeat the man who created my minimum wage reality. I needed seed money. Not enough to luxuriate, but enough to buy time. The most expensive commodity a woman fighting for her life can possess. Time to study. Time to transform. The thought of finding a solution in the chaos felt like searching for a single grain of sand on a vast beach. But despair has a peculiar way of forcing you to look in the places you've avoided. The one place I hadn't touched since the move was the last remnant of my old life, tucked away in the deepest corner of the storage unit, a dusty box containing the belongings of my late maternal grandmother, Alara. Grandma Alara was a quiet, formidable woman. She was the one who always kept her mouth shut when the family descended into petty drama, the one whose silence always felt more potent than any shouted argument. She was the original master of the power of silence. One rainy Saturday, needing a break from the tyranny of budgeting and job applications, I drove to the unit. The air inside was stale, smelling faintly of old paper and abandonment. The box was heavy, sitting beneath Mark's forgotten golf clubs. A symbolic gesture, perhaps, of the true division of value in the universe. I hauled the box back to the condo. Inside, there were the usual suspects of a life well lived: yellowed recipes, a collection of delicate porcelain thimbles, and letters tied with faded silk ribbon. Sentimental, yes, but not financial. I was about to close the lid, accepting that this was merely a trip down memory lane, when my hand brushed against a thin, heavy manila envelope taped firmly to the bottom of the box. It was hidden with the efficiency of someone who didn't want the contents easily discovered. I tore it open. Inside, there wasn't cash, or gold, or jewelry. There were legal documents, brittle and decades old. The title was printed in archaic formal script: Irrevocable Educational Trust for Sarah Louise. My breath hitched. The document wasn't signed by my parents, nor by Mark. Of course not. It was signed by Alara. I sat there, frozen, the world outside the window melting away. Grandma Alara, who passed away 10 years prior, had established a small private trust shortly after my marriage to Mark, well before the word divorce had even entered our vocabulary. She had put a modest sum of money, mostly conservative utility stocks, into an account that was only accessible under two conditions: my absolute and undeniable need for a fresh start, or upon Mark's death. The conditions were spelled out in Alara's precise copperplate handwriting in an accompanying letter. Sarah, my darling girl, you are resourceful, but Mark is calculating. I have seen the way he measures people. If you are ever truly alone, if he ever uses his knowledge to cut you down, use this. This is not for pleasure. It is for education. It is your sword and your shield. You will need to learn his language to defeat him. The twist, wasn't the amount, which, after a decade of careful compounding, was significant, but not staggering. It was the timing, the intention. Alara had seen the danger in Mark long before I was willing to admit it. She had quietly funded my exit strategy, not with an inheritance that could be contested, but with a tool specifically designed for my independence. It felt less like a financial windfall and more like a whispered, posthumous counsel. The realization brought a rush of emotion so profound it bordered on agony. Mark had belittled my intelligence, claiming I lacked the competence to manage basic finances. He had used his knowledge of the law to make me feel small, but here, from the silence of my grandmother, was the capital to buy a new form of competence. The total was enough to cover the comprehensive real estate brokerage and investment course. I had already researched the expensive, intensive one that would take up nearly 6 months of my life, and still leave enough for basic bills and Sophia's enrollment in a community piano class. A temporary measure, but one that preserved her passion. The shame of defeat began to dissolve, replaced by the cool, hard resolve of purpose. This wasn't just about money, this was about the moral dichotomy coming into sharp focus. Mark represented greed, manipulation, and the misuse of systemic power. Ilara, and now myself, represented quiet preparedness, strategic defense, and the righteous use of knowledge. I spent the rest of the evening making calls, my voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and steely determination. I used the money, Ilara's gift, to enroll in the most rigorous, fast-tracked course I could find. I remember the conversation with the admissions counselor, a woman named Vanessa. "It's a huge commitment, Sarah. 6 months of intensive study. Are you sure you can handle the material and the workload while managing a home?" Vanessa asked, her voice laced with skepticism that only fueled my fire. Tell me what Mark Harmon would do, I thought, looking at the trust documents lying on the table. What Mark Harmon would do is find the toughest, most challenging route, and he would crush it. I looked up, meeting Vanessa's virtual gaze. I'm not doing this to get a license, Vanessa. I'm doing this to understand the underlying mechanisms of ownership and valuation. I need to learn exactly how property changes hands, how contracts are enforced, and how money is truly made and protected in this city. I need to learn Mark's language, syllable by syllable. Well, Vanessa replied, a slight note of respect entering her voice. That's a different goal entirely. We start next Monday. The ascent had begun. The tears had dried. The begging was over. I was no longer Sarah, the abandoned ex-wife. I was Sarah, the funded student of the system, armed with my grandmother's wisdom and the sheer, brutal determination to ensure Mark Harmon paid the price for every single tear Sophia had shed. Mark wanted to cut me down to nothing. Ilara had given me the foundation to build an empire out of his malice. He wouldn't just see me rise, he would fund the education that would ultimately lead to his downfall. He just didn't know it yet. The old Sarah was gone. The new one was busy registering for her first class, ready to turn betrayal into expertise. I was ready to learn the art of the acquisition. Chapter 4: Learning the Enemy's Lesson. The moment I clicked Confirm on the enrollment screen for the Advanced Real Estate Brokerage and Investment Program, the noise in my head, the static of shame and the buzz of financial anxiety, fell silent. The Ascent Didier Niat was no longer a hope. It was a grueling, non-negotiable mission. Mark had relied on the assumption that I would fold. He assumed my grief and my lack of legal expertise would leave me permanently disadvantaged, forever stuck in the defensive posture of a victim. What he failed to account for was the chemical reaction that occurs when a mother's instinct to protect collides with a lifetime of pent-up indignation. That collision created a discipline so severe, so absolute. It felt less like learning and more like intellectual warfare. My life became a blur of highlighter yellow, coffee stains, and the cold, sterile language of contracts. I was a student again, but this time, the stakes were higher than any GPA. The FA curriculum was my enemy's playbook. Every session on commercial valuation was a drill in understanding how Mark's firm moved money. Every chapter on title searches and zoning laws was a lesson in the architecture of his power structure. I didn't just study for the license. I studied for the counterattack. My days were ritualistic. I would wake before dawn, review complex financial models while Sophia slept, attend intensive morning lectures, and then spend my afternoons doing the true, specialized work. That specialized work was Mark. I dug out every single piece of legal correspondence, every deposition, every contract Mark had ever left lying around the house over the 20 years of our marriage. These weren't just old papers, they were the blueprints of his mind. I analyzed his aggressive stipulations, his favored closing clauses, and the predatory language his firm, Harmon and Associates, used to corner vulnerable clients. I saw patterns. Mark wasn't a genius. He was a meticulous predator. He specialized in finding the small, easily overlooked legal vulnerabilities high in real estate holdings, particularly those involving multi-unit commercial properties and complex corporate tax structures. His talent wasn't creation, it was exploitation. The How internal monologue. During those months was a relentless echo of his arrogance. How would Mark argue this zoning variance? Where would Mark hide the collateral for this commercial loan? I was wearing his cold, calculating logic like a suit of armor. The only difference was my purpose. I was learning his mechanics, not to exploit the weak, but to dismantle the exploiter. The physical toll was immense. I was drinking from a fire hose of information: securities law, property management, corporate shell structure, all while managing the daily grind of motherhood on a subsistence budget. I couldn't afford a babysitter or expensive tutoring. My motivation was Sophia's face when I had to tell her the piano lessons were off. It was the sharp, bitter memory of Mark's cruel public offer to buy my right to raise her. That memory became my climax of effort. Every time fatigue threatened to pull me under, I would pull out the faded recital program from the year before, look at the blank space where Sophia's name should have been, and the fire would reignite. This suffering is temporary. His downfall will be permanent. I adopted the ha-moral dichotomy of my grandmother's approach: silence and strategy. I didn't tell a soul about the depth of my studies. I answered general questions about my courses with vague answers about getting back on my feet. My silence wasn't a weakness. It was a fortress protecting my plan. One pivotal moment came during the property analysis module. We were assigned a case study on commercial foreclosure proceedings in the downtown Austin area. The case involved a small, struggling LLC that was about to lose a valuable piece of property due to complex, deliberately confusing tax liens. I realized, with a chill that went straight to my bones, that Mark had consulted on this very case years ago, advising the larger predatory corporation that was now poised to snatch the property. I had seen the name of the victimized LLC in his old files. The case study wasn't abstract. It was a direct view into the machinery of Harmon and Associates. It taught me the ultimate lesson. Mark's weakness was his arrogance. He used the same playbook over and over because he believed no one he considered inferior, like me, like his victims, would ever learn to read it. He confused predictability with invincibility. The final examination loomed, a 9-hour marathon of legal codes and financial calculations. I walked into the testing center feeling like a fighter stepping into the ring. This wasn't a test of recall. It was a test of discipline. I finished hours early, my hand cramping, but my mind clear. When the results came back 2 days later, I didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. I had scored in the 99th percentile, a statistical anomaly for a first-time test taker. I simply looked at the crisp professional certificate bearing my name, Sarah Harmon, licensed broker, and felt a profound sense of cold validation. The transformation was complete. I was no longer fighting with emotion. I was fighting with capital and code. I had successfully transformed the grief from the tipping point into the intellectual infrastructure for the reckoning. The time for studying was over. Now it was time to put the enemy's lessons to use. I knew the vulnerabilities in Mark's system. Now I just needed to find the unsingle, perfect point of leverage that would make his whole empire tilt. I was ready to hunt. Chapter 5. A Crack in the Mask. Passing the broker's exam wasn't a victory. It was merely the procurement of a required tool. I didn't frame the certificate or indulge in a single moment of congratulatory relief. The true work, the work of the reckoning, was about to begin. I was no longer Sarah the student. I was Sarah the hunter. And my prey was the biggest, most arrogant target in the city, Mark Harmon's professional empire. I knew my initial move couldn't be subtle, but it had to be completely anonymous and devastatingly precise. I wasn't interested in making a small dent. I was aiming for the foundational supports of his entire structure. And for a man like Mark, whose identity was inextricably tied to his perceived professional dominance, the foundation wasn't his law practice itself. It was the symbolism of his success. I began hunting for vulnerability. I didn't look at typical broker listings. I plunged into the murky underbelly of commercial real estate data. Tax foreclosure auctions, complex litigation files, and the City Council's future development dockets. These were the documents Mark lived and breathed, the places where fortunes were quietly made and ruined. I spent countless hours sifting through thousands of filings, my focus laser sharp. The exhaustion was constant, yet the memory of Sophia's face, the shame of that public scene at the music school, was a perpetual infusion of pure adrenaline. The internal monologue was now entirely transactional. Where does Mark want to expand? Where is he putting his prestige? Where can I become an immovable obstruction? Mark wasn't just my ex-husband. He was my first and most complex case study. His current firm, Harmon and Associates, was riding a wave of national success, attracting high-profile corporate clients. To sustain this image of relentless growth, they needed to expand their physical footprint, a new grand office space that screamed power. I remembered the whispers from our marriage, years ago, when Mark's ambition was at its zenith. He was always obsessed with a building known locally as the monolithic Tower Annex, a key, adjacent property situated perfectly to consolidate his firm's presence downtown, giving him total street visibility and bragging rights. I pulled the current title and history on the monolithic Tower Annex. The records were a mess, exactly what I had hoped for. The property was currently entangled in a protracted multi-party dispute concerning complex historical tax liens and easement rights. It was a legal quagmire so dense that the actual transfer of the deed had been stalled for 18 months. This was the crack in the mask. For Mark, the public face of perfect legality and seamless success, acquiring a property that was a legal dumpster fire was untenable. His reputation was too valuable to risk getting bogged down in messy, high-profile real estate litigation. He needed the annex, but he couldn't publicly touch the current owner, a small, cash-strapped developer whose only recourse was a lengthy, debilitating court battle. This realization brought on a terrifying exhilaration. Mark was waiting for the dispute to be settled, waiting for the seller to capitulate, so he could swoop in and buy the clean title, maintaining his immaculate facade. My advantage was simple. I was invisible. I immediately got to work establishing my legal identity. I registered a limited liability company, LLC, through a highly discreet legal trust I retained using the last of Alara's funds. I named the company SL Holdings, short for Sarah Louise, but sterile enough to be meaningless to the outside world. I created layers of corporate separation, ensuring that if anyone searched the ownership structure, the trail would end at a faceless legal entity, nowhere near my name. Mark had taught me to use legal complexity not for profit, but for protection and concealment. I was turning his own tactics against him. The new problem was speed. Mark's firm was known for their patience. They could wait out the small developer until they bled dry. I couldn't wait. I needed to insert myself into the equation before the current owner folded, while the title was still messy and the property was thus undervalued. My strategic pivot became razor sharp. I would buy the mess. Using the remaining funds from Alara's trust, I secured a specialized short-term loan, leveraging my newly obtained brokerage credentials and my absolute conviction. My target wasn't Mark. It was the struggling developer who owned the annex. I contacted the developer's attorney, not as myself, but as the acquisitions agent for SL Holdings. My voice was professional, devoid of emotion, quoting legal statutes and financial penalties like Mark himself. The attorney, exhausted by the endless litigation, was intrigued by a sudden, cash-ready buyer willing to take on the existing legal risks. I made an offer, a significant cash offer that provided the developer with an immediate, clean exit from the agonizing dispute. The catch? The sale had to be closed within 72 hours, taking on the title risks immediately. The attorney accepted. Mark had waited for the perfect moment. I created an impossible one. The moment the wire transfer was confirmed and the deed recorded under the name SL Holdings, I felt the world shift on its axis. The heavy, cream-colored document from Chapter 1, the one that declared me financially worthless, was nullified by this one single act of financial warfare. I sat in my barren condo staring at the newly notarized deed, now officially naming me the owner of the entangled, problematic, and absolutely vital monolithic tower annex. The twist was complete. The property Mark needed for his ego, his expansion, and his public image was now legally controlled by the woman he had publicly humiliated and legally discarded. I registered the change of ownership with the City Property Tax Office, sending the notices to all relevant parties, including Harmon and Associates, who held easement rights on the property line. The entire transaction was clean, legal, and completely untraceable back to Sarah Harmon. I allowed myself a thin, cold smile. The mask of arrogance Mark wore was about to crack. He was about to come face to face with an immovable obstruction, an anonymous entity that held the key to his next great success. The hunter had secured the perfect snare. The ascent was complete. Now, the reckoning was ready to commence. Chapter 6: The Ultimate Trap. The signed deed to the monolithic tower annex was not a piece of paper. It was the detonator. The ascent was done. Now, the reckoning moved into its chillingly mechanical phase. My power lay not in confrontation, but in utter bureaucratic anonymity, a privilege Mark Harmon, with his public-facing empire, could never afford. I had learned from my grandmother that the deepest revenge is often the quietest. I wasn't going to storm his office and throw the deed in his face. That was an emotional move, easily dismissed. I would instead allow his own arrogance, his rigid adherence to system and status, to become the teeth of the trap. The first step was to finalize the infrastructure of my invisibility. Through my broker connections, I contracted an impersonal, highly specialized commercial property management firm in a different state to act as the sole point of contact for SL Holdings. They knew nothing of Sarah Harmon, only the corporate name and the mandate. Maximize the value of the annex by strategically obstructing Harmon and Associates. The climax of strategy began with a simple, calculated legal maneuver. Harmon and Associates needed the annex's adjacent lot for their planned $20 million vertical expansion, specifically for a necessary utility easement and access during construction, a standard, required procedure they had taken for granted. 2 days after SL Holdings officially closed the annex deal, the management firm sent a notice to Mark's firm via certified mail. It wasn't accusatory, it was purely transactional. The subject line was sterile. RE, Review of Easement Access and Development Stipulations, Monolithic Tower Annex, SL Holdings. The content, which I had meticulously crafted, was devastatingly precise. It formally denied Mark's existing informal easement access. It then offered an alternative, a non-negotiable long-term lease of the adjacent parcel for $85,000 per month, payable yearly in advance, effective immediately. The terms included stringent environmental liability clauses and a non-starter. Any failure to pay resulted in immediate termination and the permanent revocation of all future access rights. This price was exorbitant, easily 3 times the market rate for a temporary construction easement, and completely absurd for the utility access he needed. But it was legal, it was clean, and it was an intentional, immovable roadblock placed directly in the path of his most cherished project. I sat back, waiting for the first ripples. The initial response was predictable. Filtering back through the management firm's automated logs to my private, encrypted terminal. It came not from Mark, but from his battalion of junior associates, the foot soldiers. Their emails were a cascade of professional indignation, demanding copies of the transfer documents, questioning the valuation, and referencing vague, irrelevant statutes. They operated under the typical Harmon and Associates assumption: intimidate the small player, and they will fold. The response from SL Holdings was a masterpiece of cold corporate indifference. All matters are finalized. Please refer to Clause 4 of the attached lease offer. The terms are non-negotiable. No argument, no emotion, just a wall of bureaucracy. This phase of the power of silence was crucial. I needed Mark to burn through his resources, his subordinates, and his patience before he himself was forced to step onto my chessboard. And Mark did, exactly as the arrogant man I knew would. Within 48 hours, the communications escalated dramatically. The language became less professional and more demanding. Finally, the emails stopped coming from the junior associates and began appearing directly from Mark's private account. The tone was sharp, aggressive, and laden with thinly veiled threats. His first email was a masterpiece of self-importance. To the principal of SL Holdings, your firm's recent lease proposal regarding the annex easement is unacceptable and, frankly, delusional. Your valuation is highly inflationary and borders on predatory. We advise you to understand the gravity of obstructing a major downtown development backed by Harmon and Associates. I suggest we meet in person immediately to settle this before we are forced to employ litigation tactics that will render your new acquisition financially toxic. Mark D. Harmon, Managing Partner. The climax wasn't the price, it was the psychological reaction. Mark couldn't tolerate the idea of a nameless, faceless entity challenging his authority, especially over a property he viewed as his rightful status symbol. He wanted a face to confront, a neck to put his legal boot on. My internal monologue was a quiet, triumphant drumbeat. Toxic? You are the toxin, Mark, and now you're breathing your own fumes. My response, relayed instantly by the management firm, was simple and devastatingly final. SL Holdings has no desire for litigation. The current terms reflect the necessary costs of interruption to our long-term investment strategy. The fee structure remains non-negotiable. Kindly forward your payment or cease communications. No emotion, no rebuttal to his threats. Just a cold, hard invoice. He responded within the hour, dropping the professional veneer completely. The email was filled with capital letters, legal bluster, and personal accusations. He had moved past strategy and into uncontrolled rage. He clearly believed this was a personal vendetta, but against whom? A competitor? A former client? He had no idea. I sat watching the exchanges, the tension coiling in my chest, not from fear, but from the satisfaction of absolute control. The man who had used legal complexity to render me worthless was now tangled in a legal complexity I had created, controlled and protected with the very knowledge he had forced me to acquire. The trap was sprung. He was spending his most valuable resource, his mental bandwidth and his professional composure, fighting a ghost. He would soon realize that the cost of the exorbitant lease was negligible compared to the cost of the delay to his massive expansion project. His clients, his partners, his ego. They all depended on that timeline. He had won his battle for a few $1,000s in alimony. Now he was facing a quarterly bill that would bleed millions, all delivered with the infuriating politeness of a perfectly legal contract. The moment for bureaucratic warfare was ending. Mark, desperate and cornered, would soon demand a face-to-face meeting, and when he did, I would finally step out of the shadows. The price for his public cruelty was about to be paid, not by his wallet alone, but by his own shattered dignity. Chapter 7. When the Price is Paid. The drive to the Monroe Building was the quietest I had experienced since the day I discovered Ilara's trust. There was no longer the frantic buzz of research or the cold tension of waiting. There was only the calm, controlled precision of an assassin walking to the final target. The suit felt like my second skin, a polished, impenetrable armor I had bought with my enemy's own discarded currency. I arrived exactly 15 minutes early, securing the head chair. A small detail, but one that signaled control. I was dressed in armor, a charcoal suit, sharp and unforgiving, the fabric a stark contrast to the faded, comfortable clothes Mark had seen me wear for 20 years. My face, schooled by months of relentless self-discipline, was a mask of professional, icy indifference. My internal monologue was simple. He forfeited the right to my warmth years ago. Today, he gets my efficiency. Mark was, predictably, 7 minutes late. Punctuality was for subordinates. Arrogance demanded an entrance. The door swept open, and he strode in, flanked by 2 junior partners, young men in expensive suits, clearly brought in as backup muscle and witnesses to the destruction of the small-time player. He didn't see me. Mark scanned the room, his eyes moving past me entirely. He was looking for the male CEO, the corporate shark. The aggressive lawyer he assumed was behind SL Holdings. He saw the empty head chair and the only person seated, a well-dressed woman, and assumed I was the assistant. "Good morning," Mark announced, his tone dismissive and impatient. "Is the principal of SL Holdings running late? We have a significant timeline to adhere to." He glanced at his Rolex, another flash of calculated arrogance. One of his junior partners, sensing the power vacuum, began setting up a projector. "Mr. Harmon, perhaps we should review our litigation strategy while we wait for the relevant parties to arrive." "There will be no litigation review," I said. The sound of my voice, clear, direct, and completely stripped of the familiar maternal softness he was used to, stopped the junior partner mid-sentence. Mark slowly turned his head toward me. His eyes were narrowed, annoyed that the assistant was interrupting the flow. He started to deliver a rehearsed, patronizing line. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a meeting for the executives." Then he stopped. The moment the light from the large window illuminated my face fully, the entire atmosphere of the room shattered. This was the main climax. The terrifying, magnificent moment of recognition. First, confusion flickered across his face. "No, it can't be." Then a tight, immediate denial, a trick of the light. Finally, the crushing, inescapable horror. His face, usually a mask of arrogant control, contorted. The color drained away, leaving the mottled, sickly gray of true terror. He looked like a statue that had just realized it was standing on a bomb. "Sarah?" he whispered, the name a ragged sound ripped from his throat. The junior partner glanced frantically between us, recognizing the personal disaster unfolding. I didn't acknowledge the intimacy of his voice. I reverted to the tone of pure, cold transaction, the one I had perfected over Chapter 4. "My name, for the purpose of this meeting, is the principal of SL Holdings." "Sit down, Mark. We have business to conclude regarding the monolithic tower annex." The junior partner instinctively reached out to guide Mark to a chair, but Mark simply collapsed into it, staring at me. His usual swagger, The powerful tie, the bespoke tailoring, suddenly seemed cheap, a costume that failed to hide the naked panic beneath. This is This is absurd, Mark stammered, fighting for control. A trick. You can't possibly own that property. You have no capital. This is a harassment lawsuit. A vendetta. It's not a vendetta, Mark, I said, my voice level and low, maintaining my complete power of silence against his emotional chaos. It's a reckoning and every piece of documentation proves that SL Holdings legally acquired the title free and clear 72 hours before your internal deadline. I pushed the counter stipulation across the table. It was a single sheet of paper, a fraction of the thick, meaningless files he had brought. You wanted to discuss the easement. The cost remains non-negotiable. However, I am now introducing a material change in circumstances as to our arrangement. I watched him read the document. His eyes widened, darting between the clauses. I had leveraged every single piece of knowledge from my studies and his old files. The document demanded not just the exorbitant lease fee, but also immediate settlement of the original alimony and child support in full, with compound interest dating back to the day he unilaterally terminated payments. More crushingly, it included a non-disclosure and non-compete clause that, if violated, would trigger immediate litigation that would expose Harmon and Associates' vulnerability to their high-profile clients. This was the climax dialogue, delivered without shouting. This is extortion, Sarah, he finally choked out, throwing the paper down. This is a gross misuse of corporate power. You are leveraging a title defect to steal from me. Steal? I asked, allowing a hint of ice to creep into my voice. Mark, you taught me the rules. You used legal technicalities to strip me of the support I was morally and legally owed. You created a material change in circumstances in my life, forcing me to pull my daughter from her only source of joy, her piano lessons. Do you remember that, Mark? Do you remember standing in the school parking lot and suggesting I was an unfit mother? He winced, the memory clearly a source of sharp pain, not for the cruelty, but for the fatal mistake it had created. This price, I continued, pointing to the exorbitant lease fee, is the cost of the delay you caused to your partners. The repayment of my alimony, however, is the moral price for making my child suffer. I am not asking for sympathy, Mark. I am demanding that you honor the debt. His rage finally broke through, but it was impotent. I'll bury you in litigation. I'll expose your fraudulent LLC. I'll take Sophia. I cut him off, my voice a final, decisive hammer blow. You'll do none of those things, Mark, because every single line of that document is perfectly legal, and every threat you make here only increases the cost to your firm, your partners and your clients' value, stability, and image. They would be very disappointed to learn that their managing partner is being held hostage by a former housewife who managed to exploit the tax loophole he was too arrogant to see. I paused, letting the implication sink in. The junior partner, reading the room and the documents, was frantically texting someone. You have two options, Mark. Option 1. Sign this agreement. You pay the full current price for the annex easement, you pay the back alimony, and you secure the silence of SL Holdings. Option 2. Refuse. I immediately revoke your easement access, file litigation against Harmon and Associates citing deliberate non-compliance, and the entire multi-million-dollar expansion stalls indefinitely, shattering your firm's reputation and opening you up to massive liability from your partners. The reckoning effect will be public. The room was silent. Mark Harmon, the man who thrived on control, was facing two locked doors, both leading to his ruin. I stood up, signaling the conclusion of the meeting. The main climax was over. You have 24 hours to sign, Mark. Send the confirmed document to the SL Holdings legal counsel. If I do not receive it, the litigation is filed, and the price will increase tenfold. I gathered my purse, leaving the settlement document and his shattered ego behind. Mark didn't look up. He was staring at the mahogany table, defeated. The man who had judged my worth by my bank account had just been stripped of his by the very system he idolized. The truth was, the financial victory felt anticlimactic. The true victory, the sweet, profound twist, was watching the mask shatter. Watching him realize that the woman he dismissed as unwarranted had just authored his professional demise. I walked out of the Monroe building and into the late afternoon sun, feeling no joy, no malice, only the quiet, cold weight of earned justice. The legal battle was concluding. The real work, the work of building a new, untouchable life, was about to begin. Chapter 8: A View from the Top Floor. The climax was over, but the story wasn't. The difference between a dramatic spectacle and true justice is often measured in the quiet, mundane details that follow. Mark had signed the lease and the settlement. Now, he had to pay. The next 24 hours were a flurry of final transactions handled entirely by the lawyers Mark suddenly had to hire to manage his own firm's self-inflicted crisis. There were no more personal emails, no threats, no pleading, only the cold, swift exchange of vast sums of money. The wire transfer confirmation hit my account precisely 2 minutes before the deadline. It was a dizzying sum the annual annex lease paid in advance, plus every cent of alimony, child support, and legal cost he had attempted to strip from me, calculated with compound interest, precisely as my counter-stipulation demanded. I looked at the number on the screen. It was an obscene amount, enough to guarantee not just financial safety for Sophia and me, but true, comfortable autonomy for life. Yet, the emotional rush was surprisingly muted. The money was merely a receipt. The true payment had been collected in that conference room when Mark's face crumpled, when his arrogant belief in his own invincibility was irrevocably broken. My internal monologue was contemplative, not celebratory. He paid for the betrayal. But what did I win? I used a small portion of the settlement not for a grand house or a flashy car, but for a single, profound investment, a premium, permanent studio space for Sophia at the city's finest music conservatory. Her piano lessons resumed immediately, taught by a professor who recognized her serious talent. I never told Sophia the full story, only that Mommy's new job paid well, and that her grandmother Alara had quietly believed in her future all along. The final act of the story occurred 3 months later, high above the city. I was standing on the 22nd floor of the monolithic tower annex, the building Mark so desperately coveted. The legal dispute I had acquired with the deed was easily settled using Mark's own repayment funds. The building was now clean, valuable, and wholly mine, SL Holdings' primary asset. I had decided not to occupy the space myself, but to lease it out to boutique law firms and innovative startups, businesses that valued honesty and hard work. But I kept one corner office for myself, designated as a place for reflection. The room offered a panoramic view of the downtown skyline. Directly across the street, in the heart of the bustling financial district, was the Harmon and Associates Tower. I could see the high windows of Mark's former office. The moral dichotomy of the entire journey was visible from this vantage point. He was down there, still fighting, still working, his empire financially bruised, and his reputation subtly tainted by the public knowledge of the disastrous, stalled expansion. He was trapped in the same system, still driven by ego and greed. But I was up here, looking down. I hadn't destroyed him entirely. That would have made me just as small as he was. I had simply built something better, stronger. and more honest on the very foundation of his malice. The conclusion of the narrative wasn't revenge, it was restoration. I had restored Sophia's passion and my own sense of self-worth. I had leveraged my pain into a legitimate, thriving career. I learned Mark's game, used his rules against him, and exited the competition, leaving him trapped in his own prison of endless ambition. I looked down at the street where Mark had publicly scorned me just months ago. The bitterness was gone, replaced by the profound satisfaction that only true autonomy can bring. This is the ultimate message I want to leave with you. The greatest, most enduring vengeance is not making your enemy suffer, but making yourself unstoppable. Mark took my money and my security, and in return, he gave me knowledge and the ruthless motivation to become something he could never defeat: a self-made woman who needed absolutely nothing from him. The price was paid. And the reward wasn't the millions in the bank, but the priceless view from the top floor, where his shadow could never reach me again.